The year 1815. To merely speak this date in the context of modern history is an act of understatement. It was a period when the very foundations upon which continental civilization stood were stripped bare, exposed for the gaze of both victors and conquerors alike. It was a time suspended between the nightmare of endless war, a conflict that had bled Europe dry of men, coin, and morale, and the promise of an utterly unpredictable dawn. The history preceding this year was one defined by upheaval. Decades earlier, continental European existence had been subjected to what many historians term the structural fragility of a bygone epoch, violently shattered first by revolution, then repeatedly by conscripted musketry. By 1814, Europe breathed a ragged sigh of relief. The wounds were deep, but there was no immediate threat, only the sheer exhaustion of humanity itself. The consequence of that exhaustion manifested in the monumental undertaking known as the Congress of Vienna. This assembly of kings, diplomats, and cynical power brokers representing Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and others was not merely a peace treaty, it was an elaborate attempt to rewrite history itself, constructing a political architecture intended to be eternal. Their goal was nothing less than institutionalizing stability. The statesmen gathered in Vienna were obsessed with one concept, the balance of power. They spoke in hushed tones of spheres of influence, buffer states, and constitutional monarchies designed to quarantine any single nation from achieving overwhelming hegemonic trajectory. The principle guiding them was a deeply ingrained fear, a terror rooted in the preceding decade's devastation, the notion that one powerful force could destabilize all others. To contain France, they argued, was thus not merely an act of punitive justice, it was an existential necessity for the preservation of the existing global order. They successfully mapped out a Europe designed to be reactionary, restoring borders and dynasties in an effort to put the clock back, to wind the mechanism of statecraft to a supposedly safer time. The map they produced was magnificent, geometrically precise, yet profoundly artificial. It ignored the surging tide of nationalism, it dismissed the democratic fervor that had been born from the Revolutionary Wars, and most crucially, it underestimated the stubborn persistence of ambition itself. For years, this delicate scaffolding held. It represented a return to an established, rigid paradigm, a quasi-concerted Europe built on mutual suspicion and interlocking treaties. The great powers assumed they had cornered the beast, they believed the fire had been banked low enough to allow mere reconstruction. They believed that through collective vigilance, peace could be legislated into existence. But history, gentlemen, rarely respects geopolitical consensus. History has a tendency toward melodrama. It favors the return of the dramatic rogue element. The first sign of the deep fault lines in this grand Viennese edifice was subtle enough to be dismissed as mere rumor. The phantom whispers began from the tiny island fortress of Elba. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man whose very name had been synonymous with relentless, overwhelming force and geopolitical upheaval for 2 decades, had sought a form of political semi-retirement. He ruled Elba as an emperor in miniature, content perhaps to observe the grand tapestry of Europe from a gilded cage. The great powers assumed his exile was permanent, that he represented a historical dead end. They dismissed him as a relic, a dangerous myth awaiting inevitable dissipation into the waves. This was their fatal misjudgment, the profound systemic blindness that would define the next few weeks. Then, in February of 1815, the impossible happened. The unthinkable materialized on the shores of Elba. The emperor himself, the master manipulator and military genius who had once dictated the fate of nations from a smoking battlefield, made his sortie. He shed the trappings of exile and resumed his active role upon the continent. This was not merely an escape, it was a meticulously planned disruption, a calculated act of political insurrection against the combined might of European consensus. The landing near the coast served as a flashpoint, instantaneously elevating the geopolitical significance of every coastal town and inland march through which he traveled. The response from the Allied monarchies was not one of coordinated triumph, but of frantic, ad hoc mobilization fueled by terror. The combined military force, the Seventh Coalition, was formed across disparate lines of loyalties, the professional, seasoned forces of Britain, the massive levies drawn from the Dutch and Belgian realms, contingents supplied by Austria and Prussia. These armies were not a singular, unified mechanism, they were a coalition knitted together by mutual necessity against an overwhelming threat. Napoleon's return ignited a chain reaction across the continent, a nexus of cascading regional conflicts. The various treaties of Vienna suddenly seemed less like elegant legislation and more like delicate origami waiting for a single drop of water to unravel them completely. Every minor principality, every strategically important road junction, became crucial ground in this dramatic chase across Europe's interior. As the coalition forces converged, their movements tracking from disparate staging grounds, from Brussels to Kassel, from ports on the Channel to fields deep within the Spanish frontier, Napoleon followed a pattern of uncanny tactical brilliance. He did not charge toward Vienna, he moved like a phantom force, weaving through the gaps in Allied planning, utilizing the vast networks of roads and river crossings that formed the arteries of continental life. The political landscape was defined by this immense speed. The very concept of borders became fluid. Commanders were racing against time, their directives traveling at the pace of mounted messengers, a chasm between imperial ambition and logistical reality. Every hour brought closer a pivotal strategic inflection point. By early June, Napoleon had not been cornered, he had commanded attention. He had successfully forced the great powers to deploy their finest troops into open field engagements, bringing them together in a narrow geographic corridor that would prove to be the decisive locus of conflict, the region around Waterloo. The armies amassed were staggering, an epical gathering of humanity's martial capability. They represented not just a collection of fighting men, but the sum total of Europe's industrial capacity, its nationalistic fervor, and its deep, abiding exhaustion. The grand illusion of Viennese peace was dissolving into military reality. The careful calibration of diplomacy had given way to the raw, unstoppable momentum of armored divisions, artillery batteries, and the relentless tread of infantry across damp earth and cobbled roads. All of it, culminating in that single, fateful gathering point on Sunday, June 18, 1815. It was a confrontation where political machination met sheer physical force, a battle whose outcome would not just decide the fate of one man, but which continent would survive the crucible of modernity. To merely speak this date 1815 in the context of modern history is an act of understatement. It was a period when the very foundations upon which continental civilization stood were stripped bare by war. The Age of Enlightenment, that grand promise of reason and self-determination, had collided violently with the entrenched mechanisms of imperial power. What emerged in the wake of Napoleon's initial defeat at Leipzig, then his astonishing return from Elba, was not merely a skirmish, but a convulsion, a systemic socio-economic dislocation that threatened to unmake Europe entirely. The continent was convulsing through what history books would later term the 100 Days, yet the true magnitude of the struggle lay in the intricate geopolitical dynamics required simply to assemble an army capable of defeating a man who had proven himself inexorable, defying every conventional law of military possibility. The campaign that culminated near Waterloo, the action itself was defined by the precise geographical necessity of the Low Countries. This land, wedged between France and the established powers, became the hinge upon which the fate of two continents would turn. It is a theater of convergence, a series of vital choke points where every road and bridge held absolute strategic importance. Here, the disparate elements of a vast coalition were meant to cohere into a singular, irresistible fighting machine, a temporary alliance born purely out of existential dread. At the core of this assembly stood Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. His forces represented the formal backbone of Anglo-Allied might, the seasoned British Army, disciplined and effective, augmented by contingents from the Prince of Orange's Netherlands, who brought a depth of local knowledge and hardened commitment. The sheer logistical capacity required to maintain such an army, feeding tens of thousands of men across volatile terrain while navigating political distrust, was itself a monumental feat of war administration. Wellington's genius lay not solely in his tactical prowess on the battlefield, but perhaps more critically, in his diplomatic skill, holding together a coalition whose members harbored deep, often bitter suspicions of one another. The grand narrative of this campaign demanded far more than just the Anglo-Dutch forces. The strategic understanding that crystallized over weeks of grueling maneuvers was that no army constituted by incomplete parts could hope to withstand Napoleon's disciplined assaults. A truly hegemonic defensive line required redundancy, it needed depth, and above all, it needed a guarantee of support from a major continental power whose involvement ensured the overwhelming disparity in force numbers. Into this volatile matrix entered the Prussian contingent, led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The incorporation of the Prussians was not merely an addition of bodies to the ranks, it represented a crucial realignment of the entire strategic initiative. Prussia, traditionally viewing itself as a pivotal arbiter of Central European destiny, found its martial spirit galvanized into service by this urgent confluence of military goals. The Prussian contribution fundamentally altered the balance of risk and reward for Wellington's command. The coalition was thus conceived in layers. The Anglo-Allied Corps provided the initial, highly trained reserve, the Dutch element ensured localized defense and discipline, but it was the commitment of the Prusso-German forces, with their numbers and their famously fierce fighting spirit, that elevated the defensive disposition from a mere tactical encampment to a genuinely massive military formation. The tension inherent in this multinational assemblage cannot be overstated. The coalition itself was held together by an abstract concept: the necessity of survival against Napoleon's renewed threat. There were differing doctrines, distinct national loyalties, and crucially, varied assessments regarding the practical deployment of forces. Would the French advance simply break the initial defensive line? Or would they attempt a sweeping envelopment? The very architecture of their defense became a case study in strategic disjunction between logistical capacity and combat expenditure. They were positioned on ground that offered formidable defensive advantages: ridges, folds in the terrain, topographical features that channeled the enemy's advance, yet this same geography also dictated rigid lines of communication. The entire plan hinged upon holding these critical points while simultaneously expecting a decisive action from units operating miles to the east. Thus, what emerged was not a homogeneous army, but a layered defensive shield. Wellington anchored the initial line with meticulous engineering and disciplined firepower. Blücher commanded the formidable depth of Prussian reserves further to the north, and together, they forged a complex tapestry of interwoven military purpose. This required an unprecedented degree of coordination among men who spoke different languages, operated under different command traditions, and whose primary motivation, while ostensibly shared, was colored by unique national grievances. The sheer scale of the operation, the mobilization of multiple armies drawn from distinct political spheres into one immense defensive posture across a few crucial kilometers of Belgian soil, was evidence of European powers accepting that no single actor could defeat the Napoleonic ambition alone. It spoke to an unavoidable geopolitical necessity, the ultimate curtain call for a military era defined by emperors and continental empires. The coming days would test this fragile edifice of cooperation, forcing these vastly different national wills, under the shadow of Wellington's unwavering leadership and contingent upon Blücher's timely intervention, to coalesce into a single, unified force, a formation built not just on muskets and cannonballs, but on the precarious, absolute trust between former rivals. This was the moment when their structural resilience would be confronted with Napoleon's final, breathtaking effort to restore his imperial trajectory. The stakes were not merely political, they defined whether modern European statecraft, built upon the principle of national sovereignty and balanced power, would finally survive. To merely speak this date 1815 in the context of modern history is an act of understatement. It was a period when the very foundations upon which continental civilization stood were stripped bare by war, ambition, and the brutal calculus of empire. If the preceding years had been one continuous conflagration, then spring 1815 was its fever pitch. The initial wave of Napoleon's return from Elba was less an invasion than a storm surge, a raw, irresistible force meeting exhausted structures. He passed through history like wildfire, unstoppable, consuming, and leaving behind only ash and geopolitical disorientation. His grand plan, the one whispered across the smoky taverns of Aachen and carried on the frantic dispatch riders, relied upon nothing less than renewed geopolitical dominance across the heart of Europe. Yet, a genius is not always a reliable strategic asset. The sheer scale of the continental system, Napoleon's attempt to smother industrial economies with embargoes and blockade, had finally fractured its own internal logic, leaving him exposed and brittle at the edges. His primary objective was clear: neutralizing the formidable coalition that perpetually threatened French preeminence, ensuring not merely a kingdom restored, but an empire cemented in stone for a century. The first critical test of this renewed ambition arrived with the campaign of the Netherlands. The initial maneuvers were marked by a breathtaking sense of operational momentum. The armies converged with terrifying efficiency, massing human resources and material might at points designed to force confrontation while maintaining tactical fluidity. Prussia, despite its recent military humiliation under Jena Auerstedt, was called back into the fold, eager, perhaps desperate, to regain relevance upon the continental stage. Ligny marks the definitive moment where Napoleon appeared to pass the strategic initiative entirely to himself. It was a masterpiece of operational art, exploiting key weaknesses in the Prussian deployment and delivering an overwhelming blow that momentarily paralyzed the coalition effort. For those weeks following Ligny, that brief period of apparent resurgence, the world watched with bated breath, convinced that this time, Bonaparte had finally stabilized his power base, having neutralized the two most formidable military forces arrayed against him. The subsequent peace treaties signed in the wake of these victories suggested a fundamental geopolitical reorientation. Europe would be once more arranged around French hegemony. But history has a way of punishing hubris with the cold, unforgiving clarity of reality. Ligny was not the end, it was merely an intermission. The assumption that tactical victory translated into systemic political stability proved to be the most profound illusion of the era. The strategic vacuum created by the perceived success at Ligny allowed for a critical shift in character, a transition from military conquest to intellectual, institutional failure. The very nature of the emerging threat shifted. It was no longer merely armies arrayed against each other, but an alliance built on revolutionary ideals and shared Enlightenment commitments, personified by Wellington's Anglo-Allied forces and the steadfast refusal of the Russian army to yield its sovereign will. The subsequent weeks demanded a complete overhaul of Napoleon's geopolitical calculus. His initial success had been largely tactical, exploiting outdated battle doctrines and coalition disunity. To truly establish his dominance, he required more than just victory. He needed reliable intelligence regarding troop dispositions, communication intercepts, and the true intentions behind the cautious maneuvers of the Allied field armies. This desperate need for perfect information set the stage for a series of catastrophic failures rooted not in bravery or courage, but in negligence, overconfidence, and institutional blind spots. The convergence toward Waterloo was predicated on these strategic miscalculations. Wellington, positioned precisely where geography and common sense dictated he should be, possessed the tactical high ground, while the Allied array provided both depth and political unity, something Napoleon struggled profoundly to replicate or dismantle. And here is where the documented history turns agonizingly dramatic. The failures of intelligence were systemic. Reports that reached Napoleon in the days leading up to the decisive battle were often fragmented, misinterpreted, or simply failed to account for the stubborn resilience of a deeply invested coalition. While his armies excelled at massing force and overwhelming frontal assaults, a breathtaking display of martial power, they critically underestimated the combined discipline of the Allied forces positioned defensively behind natural obstacles. The period between Ligny's decisive conclusion and Waterloo's definitive clash represents perhaps the most profound example in military history of a supreme tactical genius encountering an insurmountable systemic weakness, the inability to adapt to intelligence limitations that challenged the assumption of inevitable geopolitical dominance. The curtain was slowly, painstakingly pulled back from a scenario where mere battlefield brilliance, the magnificent artistry of command at Ligny, could not overcome the fundamental reality of coordinated Allied resistance and the critical lapses in operational foresight. The next day, the stage would be set for the ultimate reckoning. A pivotal geopolitical juncture awaited them, one that would finally define whether Napoleonic power was merely a brilliant flash, or if it possessed the enduring tectonic force required to reshape the entire Western European order. The accumulated weight of Ligny's hubris and the profound failures in intelligence were about to collide with Wellington's immovable line. To merely speak of June 18, 1815, to utter that date in the context of modern history, is an act of profound understatement. It was not just another day on a map, marked by troop movements and cannon smoke. It was the final, agonizing breath drawn by the continental dream of Napoleon Bonaparte. It was the culmination of years, even decades, of protracted geopolitical struggle, all leading to this cursed stretch of ridge in the lowlands of Belgium. We are here at Waterloo. The air itself seems charged with an almost unbearable tension, the scent of gunpowder mixed with rain-soaked earth and desperate anticipation. Before us lies the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge, a geological fault line upon which entire empires were built and destined to crumble. This ridge, strategically vital and brutally exposed, became the stage for one of history's most brutal acts of attrition. The narrative we are about to unfold is not merely about a battle, it is about causality writ large, the moment when an immense historical engine finally loses all momentum. It concerns the dissolution of imperial authority in a single, decisive morning. As dawn broke on June 18, the landscape was deceptively calm. The advance guard movements had already begun to define the theater. To observe this vast gathering of men and material, the sheer weight of Allied armies arrayed against the remnants of French glory, is to confront a paradigmatic instance in military history. We see here, initially, the Anglo-Allied forces under Wellington's disciplined command. Further afield, the nascent, highly competent Prussian contingent arriving at the periphery, ready to pivot history with their presence. The geopolitical tensions were not merely between opposing armies, they spanned entire nations and conflicting ideologies, the promise of intellectual ferment underpinning democratic principles clashing violently with the old guard of military autocracy. Every soldier present was carrying not just a musket or a cannonball, but the fate of an emerging European order. The early hours of June 18 are characterized by painstaking, measured deployment. The initial engagements were not sweeping cavalry charges across open fields, they began with methodical artillery's assaults, a grinding exchange of fire that sounded less like conflict and more like the deep, systemic shuddering of a planetary crust splitting apart. The cannonade commenced methodically, defining the parameters of the fight. The gunners on both sides understood that in this specific piece of ground, artillery was not merely supportive firepower, it was the primary tool for shaping the battle space, for battering down morale, and for clearing the dense undergrowth that provided crucial cover. The Mont Saint-Jean ridge offered a formidable defensive position, a narrow, commanding elevation that allowed those who held it to observe, coordinate fire upon, and inflict devastating casualties upon any force attempting to cross the fields in the face of the French vanguard. The defending lines, utilizing the natural contours of the land, the dips, the rises, the low-lying approaches near what would later be known by local names like La Belle Alliance, were expertly chosen by Wellington's staff. The initial assaults launched by the French forces were not grand charges into a vacuum, they were calculated probes, waves of men testing the rigidity of the Allied lines. These early engagements serve as crucial dramatic foreshadowing. They revealed the gaps, exploited the vulnerabilities, and gauged the precise moment of maximum psychological pressure upon the assembled defenders. The smoke rising from the artillery was not just acrid powder residue, it was a visible shroud marking the point where grand strategic planning met brutal, immediate violence. The air vibrated with a sound that is almost impossible to truly convey, a deafening, rhythmic roar punctuated by the sharp crack of rifles and the thud of solid shot hitting the damp soil. As the morning wore on, we witnessed the sheer tactical discipline required to maintain cohesion under such unbearable pressure. When an assault wave would surge forward, believing themselves unstoppable, they were met not with a single crushing blow, but often with relentless, disciplined counterfire from multiple hidden angles of approach along that crucial ridgeline. The early struggles highlighted the deep commitment to field fortifications and defensive artillery discipline. The tactical genius displayed by the Anglo-Allied commanders in utilizing limited, predetermined firing zones ensured that every attacking advance was met with maximum, concentrated resistance at points of critical convergence. This opening phase, this grueling period of constant shelling, probing movements, and localized but intense clashes before the main lines fully clashed, is arguably more instructive than any single cavalry charge that followed. It is here, in the smoke-choked dawn hours, that the strategic momentum was repeatedly denied to Napoleon's forces. The inability to break the defensive axis established on Mont Saint-Jean proved a continuous geopolitical hemorrhaging of French offensive power. It was an operational failure of coordination for the French command, a systemic breakdown rooted in overconfidence and underestimating the sheer resilience of the defense. Every volley fired into the smoke, every man maneuvering through the mud and cordite haze, served to illustrate a fundamental truth, that while the imperial dream possessed staggering momentum and historical weight, it could be stalled, resisted, and ultimately broken by disciplined adherence to localized geography and tactical resolve. This single morning, culminating in these early engagements at Mont Saint-Jean, marked more than just an arrest of an army's advance. It was a profound inflection point, the geographical anchor where the tide of continental power finally began, irrevocably, to turn against the crumbling structures of the old regime. The stage had been set for something terminal. The battlefield, by mid-afternoon, was a theater of brutal, grinding attrition. The initial fury had cooled into the disciplined, savage exchange that characterizes an army fighting for its very existence. Napoleon's Grand Army, having absorbed and battered the Allied corps in successive waves of attack, first on the northern flank, then sweeping through the main lines, had achieved a near-total operational dominance. For many observers, staring across the smoke-choked fields toward Mont Saint-Jean, it appeared that the hour of imperial triumph was upon us. The fate of Europe seemed hinged solely on the remaining resilience of Wellington's line and the tenacity of Blücher's distant advance. But history rarely allows a climax to be so clean, so decisive, or so geographically contained. Great movements, the kind that redefine epochs, are often preceded by moments of profound disquiet, moments when the grand strategic calculus falters, replaced by the messy, unpredictable reality of men marching under fire and across contested sovereignty. For Blücher's arrival was not merely another influx of battalions, it was an abrupt, tectonic shift in the very dynamics of regional hegemony. It marked the moment where the geopolitical ambition of continental empires collided with the sheer, desperate physical stamina of a professional army driven by honor and necessity. The strategic initiative, which had been so arrogantly held by Napoleon since dawn, began to subtly but inexorably slide away from the French curtain of smoke toward the eastern marches. The Prussians, a force built upon Prussian discipline, meticulous organization, and perhaps most critically, an unwavering sense of obligation, had spent days marching through punishing terrain. Their path was not one of linear attack, but of pivotal deployment, a strategic feint combined with relentless pressure. They were always operating on the edges, observers keenly aware that their true value lay not in a single grand assault, but in their ability to stabilize the Allied flanks and prevent the catastrophic encirclement that Napoleonic genius so often sought. What we are witnessing here is the high-stakes interplay between geopolitical ambition and local military contingency. Napoleon had systematically accounted for every major threat, the British corps, the German contingents fighting under Wellington's banner. But he failed to fully model the unwavering commitment of a combined force like the Prussians, a dedication rooted in deep personal rivalry with the French regime, and underscored by an absolute refusal to allow their comrades to be cut down. Consider the immense logistical challenge faced by Field Marshal Blücher and his corps under the shadow of Prussian command. They were not advancing toward Wellington's prepared lines directly, rather, they marched along the extended line of engagement, a flanking maneuver designed less for immediate combat and more for operational synergy. Their purpose was to force Napoleon into an untenable dilemma: defend against two separate, converging threats, the concentrated Anglo-Allied corps, and this distant, highly disciplined hammer blow forming on the flank. The inherent danger in this fluid situation is one of information asymmetry. Wellington, anchored in his methodical defense, could gauge the immediate threat, but the true depth of the Prussian advance was a constant, unsettling question hanging over the Allied command structure. Napoleon, increasingly reliant on marshals whose loyalties sometimes wavered and who were now fighting against two forces simultaneously, was forced to commit reserves and redirect energy simply tracking this distant movement. This is where the concept of operational synergy becomes critically evident. The British corps fought with professional precision, Wellington's supporting German regiments provided essential continuity, but it was the relentless, inexorable pressure emanating from the Prussian flank that began to unravel the French tactical masterpiece. Their arrival fundamentally changed the nature of the combat from a localized clash of frontal assault into a protracted struggle for positional advantage and defensive integrity across an impossibly broad front. As afternoon deepened, the Prussians were no longer merely observing, they were inserting themselves into the narrative with palpable force. They began arriving at key positions that had previously felt secure, turning seemingly stable segments of the Allied line into pivot points of renewed conflict. Every cannon blast now carried not just the weight of individual bravery, but the historical weight of strategic inevitability. The Prussian march did more than merely add troops to the battlefield, it provided the operational framework for the final phase of engagement. By threatening the French right flank, a weakness Napoleon could never fully neutralize despite his genius, the Prussians forced Marshal Grouchy's detachment, which had initially been meant to contain them, into a series of increasingly desperate and ultimately futile actions. The narrative tension ratchets up dramatically because Blücher's movements forced Napoleon to react not just to Wellington's static resistance, but to an expanding threat that demands attention across the entire geographical scope of the battle. The French army was built for the centralized shock assault, it was ill-equipped to manage a multi-vector crisis demanding resources and focus along miles of contested sovereignty. Thus, on this dreadful day in June 1815, we witness history passing the strategic initiative not through a single glorious charge, but through the disciplined persistence of marching feet. The relentless tramp of Prussian boots was the counterpoint to the devastating thunder of French artillery, a sound promising that, despite Napoleon's seeming dominance, the great machinery of continental power was on the verge of mechanical failure. It was the unstoppable weight of history arriving from the east, turning the tactical encounter into a definitive confrontation for the future structure of modern Europe itself. The afternoon sun, which had begun to bleach the battlefield into a sickly pallor, was now merely an indifferent witness to the industrial-scale carnage below. By this point in time, by late June 1815, the initial fever pitch of battle had not broken, rather, it had entered a phase far more profound and tragically cyclical, the grinding attrition of systemic collapse. The air over the plain remained thick with powder smoke, mixed now with the metallic tang of spent blood and the coppery stench of sheer exhaustion. For Napoleon, after hours marked by desperate tactical adjustments and successive waves of counterattack, the battlefield was less a collection of fighting men and more a monumental ledger recording the cost of continental ambition. The French Imperial Army, having paid dearly for its defiance, now stood poised on the brink, a vast machine fueled by ego, adrenaline, and historical momentum, yet already structurally compromised by distance, logistical strain, and the relentless pressure of superior coordinated resistance. The geopolitical imperatives guiding Napoleon's action remained absolute. He must shatter the combined Allied coalition before it could reconstitute into a lasting power structure that defied Parisian supremacy. His goal was not merely to win Waterloo, it was to redefine Europe itself, eliminating every institutional impediment, monarchy, constitutionalism, or burgeoning industrial strength that had challenged his claim to ultimate dominion. Yet, operational reality began to diverge violently from grand strategic intent. The sheer size of the Allied forces, anchored by Wellington's disciplined Anglo-Allied line and buttressed by fresh detachments, meant that every French maneuver consumed resources with a brutal efficiency. Napoleon was forced into a series of increasingly desperate tactical gambits, predicated on exploiting moments of local disarray rather than overcoming an opponent whose resolve seemed geometrically limited. It is here, in the heart of this protracted geopolitical struggle, that we must pay acute attention to the Belgian contingent. These forces, comprising elements from various regions caught within the shifting currents of the great European powers, were not merely reserve infantry, they represented a complex socio-political determinant of the moment. Their presence meant an additional layer of tactical unpredictability for both sides. They were a buffer, yes, but also a fluid element that could be leveraged to create or negate entire sectors of the battle line. The successful maneuverings of these reserves throughout the day bought time that Napoleon desperately required to consolidate his position and prepare for the decisive, knockout blow. The inevitable catalyst for reversal, however, was not found in the ranks immediately before him. It came from the east. For weeks preceding this encounter, the movements of the Prussian forces under Field Marshal Blücher had been a whispered geopolitical rumor, a necessary but tangential element in Napoleon's calculations. He believed his own core fighting units and Belgian detachments were sufficient to crush Wellington's forces alone. The genius of Napoleonic strategy often rested on isolating the opponent. The tragedy of this particular day lay in underestimating the persistence, the dogged will, of those who marched from disparate directions purely because they felt a historical debt, or perhaps just professional duty, to prevent an empire's collapse. As the curtain begins to draw on the afternoon, Napoleon finally makes his most profound and deeply dramatic commitment: the deployment of the Imperial Guard. The Guard was not merely an elite unit, it was the physical embodiment of the Napoleonic dream, the core masculine ideal that promised undying martial virtue, a professional singularity designed to break the spirit before the line. The expectation radiating through Napoleon's command structure, and indeed throughout Europe's learned military circles, was simple: when all other avenues failed, the Guard would deliver the coup de grace. It was expected to be the structural catalyst for the Allied rout. And so came the charge. A magnificent, harrowing, terrifying rush of bayonets and polished steel, the final, desperate expenditure of martial capital. The sheer psychological impact must have been immense. For a brief span of time, history seemed poised at the edge of an almost unbelievable dramatic suspension, the culmination of decades of warfare resting on this single-wave assault. The force met the coordinated line of Wellington's infantry. And here resides the critical reversal point. It was not simply that the British lines held. It was the convergence, the devastating, overwhelming synergy achieved by the integrated defense, the steady fire of the English ranks meeting the unexpected flanking pressure from the Prussian vanguard, who had arrived with a force and an intensity never before encountered on this theater of war. The French momentum, which had been building inexorably throughout the day, did not encounter emptiness. It slammed into a fortified wall of coordinated firepower and disciplined reserves. The Guards were magnificent in their charge, yes, but they became victims of their own symbolic weight, unable to break through a combined defense that was finally, terrifyingly, perfected by coordination across national lines. The failure here was as much a geopolitical one as it was tactical. Napoleon had miscalculated the enduring capacity for Allied solidarity. He fatally underestimated how the shared struggle against overwhelming tyranny could forge iron alliances stronger than any treaties he had signed. The defeat of that day did more than end an army. It represented the final, definitive structural catalyst for geopolitical realignment across a continent starved of stable power. It marked, irrevocably, the close of an epoch, and the beginning of an era defined by the very principles of national sovereignty that Napoleon's empire had so violently sought to suppress. The tide, once impossibly high with imperial ambition, finally turned, receding into the vast, cold reality of irreversible decline. By late afternoon on June 18, 1815, the field at Waterloo was no longer merely a stage of conflict. It had become an agonizing terminus for decades of continental ambition. We are witnessing more than simply a defeat. We are watching the definitive collapse of a deeply rooted system, a structure built upon revolutionary fervor, Napoleonic genius, and the sheer force of will. The grand design that Napoleon envisioned, one predicated on his own hegemony over Europe, was unraveling with horrifying rapidity. The antecedent military dispositional factors leading to this moment were vast and terrifyingly complex. On one side stood a French army, a composite force cobbled together from elements across the continent, imbued with the ferocious loyalty or sometimes desperate resignation of men who had marched through unprecedented campaigns. Their goal, their declarative strategic intent, was nothing less than the restoration of an absolute power, re-establishing a divinely sanctioned order that would sweep away the fragile republicanism that Europe seemed to embrace in the interim. But facing them stood something fundamentally different. Across no man's land operated the coalition, the disciplined weight of British regulars, the reliable firepower of Prussian forces under Blücher, a force whose presence was perhaps geographically an improbable necessity, and the steadfast resolve of various German contingents. The contest here, in its most profound sense, transcended mere military might. It was a struggle between revolutionary idealism, which sought continuous upheaval, and a newly awakened consciousness of national identity coupled with practical, unyielding discipline. As the fighting ground into its final, brutal crescendo, the genius of Napoleon's command structure proved fatally susceptible to two critical, unavoidable forces: the strategic overextension inherent in his original deployment, and the perfect, converging coordination of his opponents. He had relied on reserves, on that legendary French resilience, to punch through any sustained resistance. But these men were running on dwindling physical resources, fueled by an increasingly brittle confidence. The tactical constraints imposed by the geography of Waterloo itself became inescapable foci for collapse. The small villages, Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, were not merely defensive positions. They were critical choke points that acted as anchors for resistance, allowing localized struggles to bleed the energy and time from Napoleon's decisive maneuvers. Every skirmish meant a delay, every delay eroded morale across the grand sweep of his army. When the Prussians arrived, their appearance was less a coordinated military thrust, and more an inevitable geological shift. They were the corrective force required by history itself. Their unexpected arrival at this precise moment, a historical antecedent that could not have been planned for or predicted, shattered the necessary assumption of operational security within Napoleon's command. The fighting fragmented into smaller, desperate actions, each confirming a profound truth: the campaign was beyond salvage. The ensuing rout was not merely a retreat, it was a cascading failure of belief. When the coordinated hammer blows began to break through successive defensive lines, first facing the disciplined volleys of Wellington's troops, and then dealing with the utterly unrelenting pressure from Blücher's renewed assault, the cohesion that Napoleon had spent years painstakingly cultivating evaporated in moments. This is where we observe the starkest example of the disparity narrative playing out on a continental scale. France was outnumbered by necessity, pinned into an increasingly confined operational space. And as discipline began to waver among certain corps, a pattern visible in the panicked withdrawal after devastating charges failed to break through Wellington's lines, the sheer weight of failure dragged men toward despair. The military consequences were immediate and utterly conclusive. The King of France, having staked his entire empire upon this day, found that his capacity for grand strategy was finally neutralized by meticulous, coordinated tactical pressure at the narrowest points on the field. His final desperate calls to rally these forces only intensified the overwhelming momentum building against him. The period immediately following the final collapse marks a profound hegemonic transition. It signaled not just the end of Napoleon Bonaparte's reign, but the theoretical dismantling of the very idea of imperial authority writ large across European history. The continental balance of power, defined by monarchical absolutism for 2 decades, was suddenly and dramatically thrown into disarray. The resulting vacuum created a volatile historical situation, a powder keg poised over the remnants of French revolutionary energy. It guaranteed that peace would be purchased with blood and agonizing compromise. From the fields of Waterloo emerged not simply a defeated emperor in exile, but Europe itself confronted by the profound necessity of defining its future structure, whether it would be governed by decentralized national sovereignty, or if the old doctrines of dynastic, central power would somehow miraculously reassert themselves. The sheer magnitude of this shift, the instantaneous transition from seemingly invincible imperial might to utter rout, cannot be overstated. It was a pivot point so decisive that it recalibrated every subsequent diplomatic effort and military strategy for the next century. The lesson etched into the muddy ground at Waterloo, under the indifferent sky of June 1815, is one of structural vulnerability, that even the most magnificent edifice of power remains susceptible to geographical inevitability and the timely convergence of relentless resolve. By late afternoon on June 18, 1815, the field at Waterloo was no longer merely a stage of conflict, it had become an agonizing terminus for decades of continental ambition. We were witnessing more than just the fall of an emperor. We were watching the final death throes of an era defined by revolutionary fervor and Napoleonic supremacy. Yet, even as the smoke cleared, shrouding the battlefield in the silence that follows monumental carnage, history was already turning its gaze away from the immediate geography of Belgium and across the vast, complex map of Europe. The true battle, the chapter that historians now dedicate endless footnotes to, was not won with cannon fire but within the gilded, oppressive drawing rooms of Vienna itself. The immediate outcome, Napoleon confined once more, represented a structural paradigm shift in European power. But the powers assembled were acutely aware that simply imprisoning a man would not restore stability, it would merely create a vacuum. The preceding century had been an epoch of interlocking systemic variables, Enlightenment ideals colliding with entrenched feudal structures, national aspirations demanding sovereign recognition, and vast colonial economies dictating the rise and fall of empires. The sheer scale of this imperial contestation demanded more than mere military resolution. It required a philosophical overhaul of how states related to one another. Enter the Congress of Vienna. Gathered in the late autumn of 1814, Europe's great powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, alongside others, convened under the oppressive necessity of architecting peace. The stakes were breathtakingly high. To fail meant a recurrence of the chaos that had swept away the French Directory and consumed continental stability in revolutionary violence. Their goal was not simply to punitive Napoleon, but to re-establish what they deemed legitimacy and secure a durable balance of power, a balance that could resist the pull of radical ideologies. The architects of this grand design, men like Metternich, spoke the language of order. They drafted principles designed to minimize the risk of any single state becoming overwhelmingly dominant again. This doctrine, known as the balance of power, became the foundational scaffolding for European geopolitics for nearly a century. It was an incredibly sophisticated geopolitical contiguity agreement, a tacit understanding that great powers would manage their relationships through consultation and collective security, rather than unilateral conquest. But this systemic attempt at perfect order contained a fundamental flaw, a fissure in its otherwise flawless marble edifice, which stemmed from the very core of the intellectual movements the revolution had unleashed decades earlier. The statesmen at Vienna were masters of treaties, of drawing lines on maps, yet they underestimated a force that was neither quantifiable by troop strength nor controllable through royal decree: nationalism. Nationalism, for all its terrifying potential, was also an irresistible historical current. It was the belief in the inherent right of a people, a collective cultural and linguistic unit, to self-determination. For Vienna, this concept was terrifyingly disruptive. They saw it as mere destabilizing romantic sentiment, the rising tide that painted across Italian city-states or German princely realms with ideals of unified identity was invisible to their grand diplomatic calculus of dynastic boundaries. The great powers' attempt to manage this conflict between engineered order and emergent self-determination led directly to what we now recognize as the Concert of Europe. This wasn't just an agreement, it was a collective management system, meeting intermittently throughout the 19th century, a multinational council designed not merely to sign treaties, but to coordinate interventions when systemic variables threatened the agreed-upon status quo. The concert acted as a profound prophylactic against great power collapse. Whenever a region displayed signs of revolutionary fervor or unchecked republicanism, whether in Italy, Poland, or German states, the powers would reconvene. They deployed armies not merely for conquest, but often to suppress perceived ideological contagion, enforcing an intricate web of conservative political principles across the continent. The period following Waterloo became the Age of Restoration, dominated by reactionary forces attempting to rewind the clock to a pre-revolutionary model. They sought to solidify borders that were economically viable and politically controllable, largely ignoring the burgeoning consciousness of distinct ethnic identities. The structural parameters they established, from the German Confederation designed to prevent any single large state from dominating its neighbors, to the meticulously negotiated spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, were brilliant, ruthless exercises in political engineering. Yet, this suppression was temporary. Every attempt to legislate away history merely pushed that revolutionary potential into a subterranean reservoir. The very stability granted by the treaties signed in Vienna created the illusion of permanence, blinding later generations to the simmering tension beneath the veneer of order. By dampening the visible flames of revolt through military might and carefully orchestrated diplomatic maneuvering, the great powers inadvertently fostered an intellectual and cultural nationalism, a kind of revolutionary seed that would finally burst forth decades later, culminating in movements far grander than any continental conflict before it. Waterloo did not end warfare, it ended an era of war. It ushered in a sophisticated, complex system of governance designed to achieve peace through meticulous management. But the deepest legacy was this enduring tension, the struggle between the stability mandated by international treaties and the undeniable, irresistible historical right of men to define themselves within their own nations. That conflict, the negotiation between dynasty and destiny, would continue to shape the modern world for centuries untold.